So over the years, there have been many silly car inventions, I'll call them, or inventions that really haven't served much of a purpose. And I have to say that one of my favorite examples of this is the so-called fuel economy vacuum gauge, or a gauge that basically says what your fuel economy is based on what the engine vacuum is. Now, for those who don't know, engine vacuum is really proportional to throttle blade opening or accelerator pedal position. If you have wide open throttle, there's no vacuum because there's effectively no throttle blade when the throttle blades are wide open. So the engine isn't producing any vacuum. And vacuum is the highest really at kind of very light throttle tip in. So if you have a gauge that reads fuel economy and it's vacuum based, it's going to show that you're getting maximum fuel economy at very light throttle and that you're getting minimal fuel economy at full throttle. Well, that doesn't take a genius to figure out. I'm sure anybody who's driving a vehicle and operating an accelerator pedal knows that when they floor it, they're not going to be getting good fuel economy. And when they have their foot just lightly on the pedal and they're coasting, that they're going to be getting maximum fuel economy. And yet, for whatever reason, the vacuum-based fuel gauge was something that was relatively popular for a number of years, kind of went out of vogue in the 1980s on American cars. BMWs had something similar. They had a little fuel economy gauge, a little needle in one of the, usually I think the tachometer had it at the bottom of the tachometer. But you haven't seen this in American cars for many years, although American cars did go to instant fuel economy digital readouts, but the gauge itself was gone. So why did this start? Well, a lot of people will say, well, this kind of came about during the OPEC embargo of 1973, and car makers started adding it to their vehicles after that, which is to some degree true. Take a look here, for instance, at this vacuum-based fuel economy gauge from a mid-1970s Oldsmobile. Now, this is from an Oldsmobile 98 that came standard with a 455 cubic inch V8. So first of all, somebody who's buying an Olds 98 with a 455 underhood, I'm not entirely sure how much they care about fuel economy because they probably have a decent amount of money. And if they wanted fuel economy, they would have bought a vehicle that didn't have a 455 V8 underhood. You could have bought a kind of upper trim, I'll call it Delta 88 Royale as an example, or you could have gone to another division and bought a Buick LeSabre that had a standard 350, even a 350 two-barrel. But if you got the largest vehicle and the most expensive in the Oldsmobile or Buick lineup, you ended up getting the big 455, at least until 1976. And so I think the fuel economy gauge is kind of silly. And like I said, it really doesn't tell you any additional information. It just says, well, geez, your throttle position is wide open. You're not getting much in the way of fuel economy, and it's basically closed, and you don't get much fuel economy. But I thought Oldsmobile at least had a nice little way of presenting the gauge, as you can see here. Now, as I said, some people will say that this came about because of the OPEC embargo, but truthfully, there were cars that had vacuum gauges even before that, although they weren't always called fuel economy gauges. They were just called engine vacuum in some cases, like on the 63 Grand Prix, where you can see on the center console, there is this big engine vacuum gauge. And on the automatic cars, you didn't even get a tachometer, but you got a vacuum gauge. So what is that supposed to tell me if the car's got an engine vacuum gauge? I don't really know. I guess it's good if you want to check that your engine is operating correctly and that you don't have, let's say, worn components. You can see it idle if the engine's pulling good vacuum. I guess that's one benefit. But aside from that, it's kind of a rather uninteresting item. Now, the car that I started showing at the beginning of this video was a Pontiac Parisienne, and you saw it had a fuel economy gauge there in one of the pods, and it says min and max, and the needle just swings back and forth dependent upon your throttle position. Not very interesting. And they would eventually change out this fuel economy gauge for a voltage charging, discharging gauge, I'll say, that was actually helpful because you could see if the alternator was working or not versus this silly gauge. Now, as I mentioned, the relative level of worthlessness, I'll say, with respect to this vacuum gauge, I think that Ford and Chrysler really thought about that because not many Fords or Chryslers had said gauges. This was really a General Motors thing when it came to the domestic market, nor did AMC's. So for whatever reason, General Motors seemed to love this on their vehicles, whereas if you bought, as an example, a Lincoln, it didn't come with a vacuum gauge or a fuel economy gauge on it in the 1970s. You just drove your Lincoln because you knew it wasn't going to get good fuel economy with that 460 V8 underhood. Or your Imperial also didn't come with a vacuum gauge, and again, it had a 440 V8 underhood, although Imperials were really good about having a full complement of gauges, everything from fuel to just fuel level, I should say, not fuel economy, to engine temperature, to alternator charging, discharging. Generally, Chrysler did a better job, I would say, than the rest of the big three when it came to gauges in vehicles, particularly luxury cars. Ford and GM just tended to have idiot lights. In any case, I digress. But I bring that up because I think one of the most interesting approaches to the fuel economy minder came from Cadillac. And in the mid-1970s, there wasn't even a gauge. Cadillac actually introduced in the upper portion of its instrument panel that it introduced for 1974, there was a little dot, a little yellow light that would come on if you accelerated relatively hard to signify to you that you were not getting good fuel economy. I remember my 1976 Eldorado that I used to have had this light, and I guess it was kind of a game to try to keep that dot off because you were burning a lot of gas with a 500 cubic inch or 8.2 liter V8 under hood. Although I have to say, in fairness to that car, it was pretty terrible fuel economy around town, maybe 7 to 8 miles per gallon. But on the freeway, I would routinely get about 14 miles per gallon at 70 miles per hour, which I thought, frankly, was pretty phenomenal for a 500 cubic inch V8. And clearly, a 76 Eldorado is not an aerodynamic vehicle. It's basically a brick that's pushing a bunch of wind. So I thought that car actually did pretty well for what it was in terms of fuel economy. And of course, it had a 3-speed automatic, so nothing really fancy there. But that Eldorado had a yellow dot. And then Cadillac ended up going to a bit more sophisticated setup, like on this Cadillac Seville that I'm about to show, where there was always this green light that was glowing to indicate that your fuel economy was relatively good. And then if you stepped on, the accelerator would turn yellow. So they had 2 lights as opposed to 1. Now, if you want to see this in operation, here it is in a 1976 Seville. Now, this car is just in park, but you can see as I blip the throttle that the green light is changing to the yellow light and back. So I thought that that was kind of cool. It's very gimmicky, and again, I don't know that it really serves any value or purpose, but, well, you could get it. It came standard on the 76 Sevilles, and you could get it on the Sevilles unless you had a diesel-equipped Seville. The diesel was introduced in 1978, and you could get it in 1979 as well. In those cases, there was no fuel economy light, so you didn't have that. And then by the time the 1980s rolled around, there wasn't that light anymore because, in general, cars were starting to get, at least the upper-end cars were starting to get digital gauges. So you did get instant fuel economy readouts, and that was less annoying than this light that was flashing and changing colors right in your direct line of sight. So I think that for that reason, the fuel economy light just went away. And I haven't really seen a vacuum gauge in a car in modern times, nor even something that was visible to read engine vacuum. On Cadillacs, you could hold the off and warmer buttons down. You could step through the various engine sensor parameters, and you could check the manifold absolute pressure. But that was something that was not visible to the customer unless you entered a so-called diagnostic mode. We'll talk about that more later. But if you've got a Cadillac from the early 80s to the mid-1990s, you have your own diagnostic mode that's pretty sweet. And I have to say that having owned a number of Cadillacs from that time frame, you really can get a great sense of everything and how it's operating on the car because you don't need an onboard diagnostic tool. The digital readout serves that function. So what do you think? Were these, let's call it fuel economy gauges or vacuum-based gauges, kind of worthless? Or did you like them? Let me know and put a comment in the comment section. Thanks again for watching.